You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
Unleashing Africa Report series was an initiative which was done by the BCG Johannesburg office. And in part, it's meant to be a pragmatic yet hopeful take on the continent's potential. When we refer to critical minerals, we're referring to a class of commodities which is essential for green technologies which are emerging. Touching on the African Continental Free Trade Area, this is a great step in the right direction. It really does paint a hopeful picture of where the continent is trying to get to in the future.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today we have Lindokuhle Shongwe, who is a project leader at Boston Consulting Group. BCG have published a report titled Africa Unleashed, Harnessing Africa's Critical Mineral Opportunity, which offers a strategic blueprint for sovereign, sustainable and scalable growth. So we'll be getting into the details of that during our conversation. So welcome to the podcast, Lindo. How are you?
Hey, Tessa. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And as always, I like to dive straight into the details. So I was hoping you could just give us a brief overview of the Africa Unleashed report. You know, what's it about, why it was written, and what you see its key message for Africa and the rest of the world.
Of course. So the Unleashing Africa Report series was an initiative which was done by the BCG Johannesburg office. And in part, it's meant to be a pragmatic yet hopeful take on the continent's potential, as well as kind of laying out some practical ways and approaches that policy leaders, business leaders, and the public can kind of implement in order to realize this potential. The critical minerals report, I think, as indicated in the name, really focuses primarily on commodities, specifically looking at critical minerals, which are essential for, I would say, applications as part of kind of the global energy transition and the like. And really what the report aims to do, in short, is really give insight into the potential of the continent, as well as lay out, practical steps to realize it.
Fantastic. So we know this is quite a specific or niche topic. So for listeners new to this topic, what exactly are critical minerals and why are they different from, say, your traditional commodities like oil or gold?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So I think taking a step back, it is important to note that the definition of critical minerals does tend to vary depending on whom you ask. But generally speaking, when we refer to critical minerals, we're referring to a class of commodities which is essential for kind of green technologies which are emerging. Think, energy transition, renewables, lithium-ion batteries, and the rest of it. But more than just, being relevant for these next gen tech applications, critical minerals also have an additional overlay, which is they are one in short supply, and that short supply primarily comes from it's just physically constrained, i.e. we don't have enough mines that produce it today, or secondly, these are minerals which, even if supply is sufficient, it is heavily geographically concentrated, which presents a supply chain risk for many downstream players. So when you overlay these two, right, it's minerals that are in high demand because of these new tech applications, as well as minerals which are in short supply, either due to just insufficient mining activity today or a high degree of geographic concentration.
You touched on their relevance to next-gen tech innovations, which is safe to say will drive global growth over the next decade. The report calls this Africa's critical decade. Why is now such a pivotal moment for Africa in the global mineral race?
Yeah, I think why it's referred to as the critical minerals decade, I think it's one to reflect the time bound nature of it. So the opportunity is not indefinite. So although kind of the conditions around the continent are, I would say, prime for us to capitalize on this opportunity, I think we really just wanted to hammer home the point that, this window of opportunity is not indefinite and at some point will close. And the reason why it is it's referred to as the critical minerals decade and why it's important and relevant is one, there is significant demand for kind of minerals which will power kind of these next gen tech applications, primarily in green technologies. Two, when you think of just the availability of supply globally, I think one, there's a huge gap in supply that has to be bridged, i.e., new mines and new supply coming online. And then lastly, when you overlay kind of the geopolitical element of it, right, we're seeing kind of this push globally for your more downstream manufacturers of batteries, electric vehicles, and the like, looking to diversify their supply chains. So as it stands today, there's this, vacuum that exists, right, where countries and regions as a whole are really vying to be the next viable destination for critical mineral supply. And as a result, there's a tremendous amount of competition, which then goes back to the earlier point, which is, at some point, this window of opportunity will close. However, I think at this point, the continent is well in contention.
You noted that the opportunity is not indefinite, but we do know that Africa holds a strategic advantage as it does hold a large share of the world's critical minerals. So I guess from that perspective, what would you say makes the continent's reserves so strategically important to the global energy transition?
Yeah, so why they're strategically important, one, they're quite vast, which is the first one. So when you're thinking about regions where you can reasonably expect to get significant supplies, particularly from a volume perspective from uncritical minerals, I think very few regions stand out the way the continent does. I think, secondly, when you think about kind of rising geopolitical tensions, the continent has actually done a pretty good job of remaining neutral amidst rising tensions globally, which then positions it quite well as a supplier of ore on the global stage. And then lastly, when we chatting around, the endowment that the continent has, I think one of the key things to note is despite having large reserves of critical minerals, when we look at the degree to which the continent has been explored fully, and this is kind of mapping and understanding the true extent of our mineral endowments, I'd probably say we're only just touching the tip of the iceberg. So I think all of these factors coming together paint this picture where, the continent will be a very strategic region going forward, specifically for the supply of critical minerals.
So, with this in mind, how would you say Africa's mineral wealth compares to other major producers such as China, Australia, South America?
Yeah, so we can talk about kind of the mineral wealth as it stands today, and then let's also talk a bit about the potential. So, as it stands today, and I'll use kind of an example from your lithium ion batteries, right, which are made up of two primary technologies, right? There's the nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistries, and then there's LFP or lithium iron phosphate. In both of these, around half of the material that makes up the battery is graphite, and then the other components are your lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt, and the rest, and phosphate and such. When you look at the continent's endowment of minerals, I think, there are certain minerals where we have an outsized advantage in comparison to other regions in the world. Starting off with graphite. So on the global stage, there are basically three primary countries where you can get graphite from. I think China controls about 70-80% of natural graphite supply. The remaining 20% is almost evenly split between Madagascar as well as Mozambique. And then you've got kind of a sprinkling of graphite across the world. When you think about cobalt, the DRC today supplies about 70%, if not more, of the world's cobalt. So it's a significant player, more on the NMC side. When you're thinking around manganese, I think South Africa is well endowed with high grade manganese reserves globally. And depending on estimates, right, this number rises from 40% of production today with reserves that can easily take it up to 80%, specifically on the high grade side. Similarly for chrome, similarly for other precious metals such as PGMs and the rest of it. So looking at the picture today, I think the continent is already a very strategic and relevant supplier, and a huge contributor to the supply chains of some of these minerals. But then on the flip side, when you think about the potential, I think I'd mentioned before that, when you look at exploration spend globally, and exploration is basically an activity which looks to find new reserves, and new resources across commodity, mineral commodities and the like. And historically, for an average, right, the continent has only accounted for about 20% of global exploration spend. So when you contextualize it within that, right, you realize that not only is the continent a significant player, but the potential is also at the stage likely understated, which then, when you're looking forward, represents significant potential for the continent to be a major player in the critical mineral space more broadly.
So I guess keeping on the theme of Africa becoming a major player, I know the report emphasizes Africa's leverage in today's shifting geopolitical landscape. So how can African nations use that leverage effectively?
I think taking a step back here, right? Historically, the continent has always been a major exporter of, call it, raw mineral wealth. The continent has always been well endowed with minerals, not just critical minerals, but across the board. You think precious metals, you think base metals, and the rest of it. But what we're seeing today, right, is a real opportunity for the continent to leverage that for its own economic benefit. And how you kind of move on that is there's a couple of things that need to come online. I think speaking around strategy broadly, I think historically African nations have had a very fragmented approach to how they think strategically around how they capitalize on their mineral endowment. So that's kind of the first point of call. The continent needs to have a clear plan for itself as to how it will capitalize. The second big piece is ensuring that you have the right legislation as well as regulation that supports that plan. And I think a key thing when you're thinking about mining more generally is that, it is a long-term investment, and any volatility, say in your regulations or your legislation, tends to scare off investment, which is looking for stability. So that's mainly on how you create an enabling environment on the country side of things. Then we need to drive into kind of what are the economic drivers of, I'd say, mining projects and midstream beneficiation projects further down the line. And really what it boils down to here is infrastructure. When you're thinking kind of your upstream mining, as well as your midstream processing, like energy is a huge input cost to kind of the economics of projects. The second big thing that needs to be addressed is I think the cost of capital on the continent is just too high. I think many projects don't make it out of the spreadsheet just purely due to the high cost of financing and capital that you find on the continent, which is linked in part to regulatory instability as well as lack of infrastructure. And then lastly, there are kind of these elements which can be built in parallel, right? Making sure that one, your having access to a skilled workforce, to your putting in sufficient investments into kind of your upstream exploration, which secures supply over the longer term. And then thirdly, more and quite important is, especially in a world which is increasingly becoming polarized, how do you form strategic alliances with end markets to secure long-term offtake, as well as improve, I'd say, fundamental economics of projects within the space?
Thank you for that. You've touched on some of these structural barriers, such as infrastructure, which are holding Africa back with regards to this. So, with infrastructure comes a lack of regional collaboration. So, I was wondering, through initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, how are we going about building distributed value chains?
No, I think that's a great question, right? And I think touching on the African Continental Free Trade Area, I think this is a great step in the right direction from a policy point of view, right? And it really does paint a hopeful picture of where the continent is trying to get to in the future. I think where, you know, the rubber hits the road and more often than not, the wheels fall off is really around the implementation. And going back to my earlier point, I think African countries in general have taken a very siloed approach to infrastructure development in general. And as a result, what that has culminated in over time is you've got certain jurisdictions which have more developed infrastructure versus others which don't. And as a result, this doesn't lend itself to, I would say, countries being able to leverage synergies from each other. So a good example here is, in order to do midstream processing of certain critical minerals, you need sufficient scale to justify the construction of a midstream facility. And in certain instances, you can only get that scale if you are able to aggregate kind of production across different countries. And in order to do that, you need good rail, road, as well as port infrastructure. But because kind of the planning has been done in a very siloed manner, this hasn't necessarily been taken into consideration. And as a result, we find ourselves in a place where much of the infrastructure we still see on the continent is still very much geared to take commodities directly from the mine to the nearest port, right, for export, and hasn't necessarily been structured around how do we make sure that we are strategically building these local beneficiation hubs where we can start to aggregate supply across different countries, in turn benefit from this great mineral endowment.
So, if we move from, say, regional collaboration and lookout, what role would you say global alliances can have, that go beyond raw resources and include things such as skills transfer and also technology?
Yeah. Again, another great question, right? I think the first point of call here is that in the report, we basically outline, I would say, three levers that the continent needs to focus on. And probably these can be more intuitively thought of as three legs of a chair, right? So all three equally important. The one is, how do you make sure that you attract investment? Two, how do you build regional value chains which enable you to get scale? And then three, how do you forge global alliances with end markets and partners which enable, one, access to markets as well as skills and technology transfer to build some of these facilities? My sense is that, these three are interdependent and one does not happen without the other. So the only way you can attract investment is if you can demonstrate that you've got sufficient viable scale to build, for example, a processing facility, which requires you to have a very regional approach to the value chain, working collaboratively with your partners and other countries. Similarly, you also need to demonstrate that you have access to end markets, i.e., you've got customers who are willing to get into long-term offtake agreements with you to secure your product, which in turn creates this virtuous cycle, right? Once you have offtake, it makes investments easier. And as you're collaborating with your neighbors, you're able to build scale. So I would think around kind of these three legs of the chair, right, as being very synergetic. And as a result, I think African leaders need to focus on all three in order to capitalize appropriately on this opportunity.
You're listening to Verto Corner, powered by Verto. Today, we're exploring how Africa's growing digital economy is unlocking new revenue if payments can keep up. Here's James Booth, Head of Revenue at Verto, on what's next for cross-border commerce. Take it away, James.
Perfect. Morning. Great to be on the show today. As you mentioned, my name's James and I'm the new head of revenue at Verto. At Verto, we provide businesses in Africa and emerging markets with access to local currency accounts, virtual accounts, and services surrounding everything from FX to payment links to payouts in certain markets. So yeah, really our end goal is to help accelerate trade and finance on the African and the Middle Eastern regions.
So with the work that you're doing, are there any new trends or activities or movements in the market that we're seeing that we should be aware of?
Well, I think Africa in particular is an interesting market. It's one of the fastest growing markets in terms of commerce or e-commerce per se. It's also one of the most complicated or difficult markets to enter. You've got varying regulations in different regions. Working with some of the local banks are generally quite difficult, especially when you're working cross borders. So certainly in terms of trends, we're seeing a lot of fintechs pop up on the continent that are trying to solve this challenge. And we're seeing a lot of inflows, especially from investors that are trying to solve these problems and these challenges. So if you compare these markets to, let's say, more of the established Western or Asian markets, there's definitely a lot more opportunity and a lot of upside still to be captured from Africa and the Middle East.
As you mentioned there's a lot more opportunity presenting itself in the African market. So looking specifically at Africa, what are the new revenue streams that are being unlocked by the digital economy?
So I wouldn't necessarily add new revenue streams. I think the opportunity is more around enhancing efficiency within existing revenue streams and accessing larger markets or expanding the size of the market. So if you think about the digital economy as a whole in Africa, you've got high FX costs, you've got fragmented rails to do cross-border transactions. Depending on what banks and settlement providers you're using, there's settlement delays, etc., which means operating on the continent is very difficult for a lot of businesses. So the opportunity ahead of us is not new. It's more about solving these efficiencies and accelerating trade on the continent and therefore expanding the size of the addressable market, because there's a few players doing it today. If you're unsure when you're going to be settled, generally businesses will be more conservative. So for me, it's about moving away from a conservative way of doing business and allowing businesses to trade with confidence.
You touched on the efficiency element. So how does Verto's infrastructure help marketplaces and or exporters unlock that efficiency and scale faster?
Today, a lot of businesses, in order to move money around Africa, they would have to engage with multiple parties. They would have to open multiple banks across the region. What our infrastructure allows clients to do is to access virtual accounts, multi-currency accounts across Africa through a single portal or through a single API, therefore reducing a lot of paperwork, a lot of business development work for them to just access intra-Africa trade, and allows them to seamlessly transact in a matter of seconds through our Verto exchange platform. So whether you require just basic FX currency exchange solutions, or you require an embedded finance solution, it's all available on a single platform. And I think that's really the value add that we're bringing to the market in the short term. It's a holistic fintech layer across the existing financial services sector in Africa.
You touched on a few value adds, but what's the one unlock you think could change the revenue game in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, we would need a long time to really go through this in detail. But I think like the one main thing is, and I go back to it, it's about reducing or removing the inefficiencies in the market and providing businesses with confidence to trade. So if you think about some of the common challenges that businesses face in Africa, a lot of it is around the FX markets, especially in markets where there's a lot of volatility. So you think about Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa with its exchange control policies. It makes it very difficult to operate in those markets. So working with a business that understands how to navigate those markets, that has strong relationships in those markets and can allow businesses to confidently trade, knowing that they've got the best rate, knowing that they've got guaranteed settlement, is, I think, one of the most important messages that I probably want to display today.
You highlighted FX volatility. So how can businesses stay resilient to FX volatility while growing across markets in Africa or globally?
Yeah. So I think it's having access to the right liquidity pools. It's having access to a platform that allows you to exchange very quickly. It's also having access to different products and services that will enhance that experience. I mean, for example, one product we just launched a few weeks ago, it's called Virtual Reserve. So Virtual Reserve effectively allows businesses to gain access to bank beating interest rates through the Virtual platform. So let's say, for example, you've got a USD balance on account or a ZAR balance on account in South Africa or a Euro balance account or Kenyan shilling or whatever it is. Instead of keeping that money in country, through Virtual Reserve, we will then do the FX for you, find the best interest rate you can get within another market or within another currency, give you interest on those accounts. When you need those funds, through the terms and conditions of that we offer in that account, you can pull those accounts out. You can pull those funds out, let's say. So things like that give businesses a lot more flexibility and it gives them more tools to manage their FX risk. But I think the main thing is just working with a provider that has the most competitive FX rates. So you can manage your FX hedging and you can manage how your treasury operations work.
Thanks to James Booth for sharing those insights on Africa's next revenue wave. For more on how to scale smart with Verto, check the episode notes for tools and links. We'll be back next week with more from Verto Corner. And now back to our interview. I'm conscious that during the conversation so far, it's been quite high level, quite theoretical, but I know the report does cite some interesting case studies such as Namibia's reform and also Morocco's battery hub strategy. And I think I saw in the DRC, Zambia battery minerals corridor. If we look at those specifically, what lessons can other African countries learn from these cases?
Yeah. I won't touch on all of them, but I think a good spotlight here is probably Morocco, which has done an excellent job of building, I would say, the downstream battery manufacturing value chain. So what Morocco has done quite successfully is that they have leveraged global alliances, specifically looking at how to use the Inflation Reduction Act, which was brought in by the US, to secure, I would say, favorable access to the US market. Secondly, I think geographically, Morocco is well positioned in terms of just proximity to Europe, right, which is also another end market for EVs and batteries that power them. And what they were able to do is that they were able to use the IRA, they were able to use kind of geographic proximity, as well as partnering with your large, I would say, manufacturers or kind of your gigafactories, primarily Chinese manufacturers, who have then established operations in the country. So what Morocco has been able to achieve is that all they have done, even though the mineral endowment is not as large as some other African countries, such as DRC, Zambia, they've effectively leveraged one strategic positioning, being close to the EU, alliances with the US in the sense of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then secondly, partnering with partners in the East in order to secure the technology, the expertise, as well as the facilities that are effectively supercharging an industry, which then feeds into the pre-existing existing automotive industry that they had in country. So this is just one of the examples in which countries can be quite creative and quite strategic in terms of how they go about developing these value chains. With Namibia, I think they've had recent success primarily in your upstream mining space, linking into the hydrogen economy and the rest. And I think a good example of what Namibia has done here is that when thinking around kind of how they've thought around legislation, which leverages, I'd say, off kind of the hydrogen economy, also linking into what they are trying to achieve with some of the minerals more generally that they have in country. They've created a regulatory regime which is quite investor friendly, right? And as a result, we're seeing significant capital flowing into Namibia, primarily in the exploration space, as companies and other players in the sector are looking to one, get in on Namibia, and two, because the regulatory environment is so favorable, we're seeing that, significant capital flows have also followed suit in light of this. So these are just kind of two examples of how countries on the continent are already starting to, how we're already starting to see green shoots across the continent, with specific countries giving very tangible examples of how to go about developing these value chains.
I guess one of the lessons that we see from this best practice is the value add and the economic and social impact. We know that money invested in mining and processing creates thousands of jobs and a major GDP impact. With that in mind, which sectors beyond mining itself stand to benefit most from this transformation?
Yeah. So maybe taking a step back, right? And let's assume, imagine in your mind, you've got an area, there's absolutely no development. Recently, there's been a massive ore body that has been found. Effectively running through the steps from construction to operation to end of life. The first step is the construction of the mine, which is heavily reliant on, I would say, heavy equipment and engineering. So think construction, engineering, project management, steel, as well as cement industries, which gain from the need to build your roads, your plants, your processing facilities on site. As you move towards the operation, I think what becomes equally important is more the energy and utilities that need to supply said facility. When you think of, I would say, mining towns broadly, right? Mines as well as mining towns, you often find that there's a power station which is built to supply the mine, but as a result of a power station being built, there is excess energy which is available to the immediate local community. And similarly, from a water point of view. So the construction of this infrastructure or energy and utilities not only benefits the mine that is being built, but more broadly, the communities which are located around the mine. You go into kind of the operations again and you think around the workforce. So mining operations are generally quite remote in areas that have had very little economic activity prior to mining. And as a result, transport and logistics becomes quite important, getting primarily the workforce to and from the mining town, but inevitably does lead to upgrades from our ports, roads, as well as storage facilities point of view. In the day-to-day, when you're thinking about your kind of typical mining process where you are refining on sites as well, whether this be through pyrometallurgical processes, which is like using fire effectively to get metals, or hydrometallurgical processes, to a certain degree, you need chemicals. Think sulfuric acid, cyanide, flotation agents, and the rest of it. And those industries also benefit from the mine being in close proximity. And outside the mine, outside of the core day-to-day operations, I think there is a huge industry that booms around mining, around kind of your finance, insurance, just given kind of the significant kind of capital intensive nature of mines as well as processing facilities. And this also filters down to your insurance companies, which cover your operational, environmental, as well as political risks. And over and above all of that, when you just think around kind of your mining workforce, so you've got a group of people who are earning a good income in a very remote area. I'm not sure about you, Tessa, but I can imagine it can be quite frustrating having money to spend but nowhere to spend it on, right? And as a result, what you find emerging outside from these mining towns is schools, hospitals, amenities, malls, areas where kind of the workforce from the mine can have an outlet and be able to enjoy kind of their hard-earned income. And as a result, you tend to see this picture where mining is not only beneficial for the primary extraction, but more often than not, and quite relevant in the case of South Africa, there are entire towns which emerge around mines, which is tremendous from an economic development point of view.
So I guess with this in mind, what would you say is the role of skill development and Africa's young workforce? What role do they play in building long-term competitiveness in the sector?
Yeah, I'd say the role that the workforce, specifically Africa's young workforce, plays in the sector is quite instrumental. I think one of the things that mining has always had, despite kind of advances in automation, is that it's always been a labor intensive, very labor intensive activity. And as a result, it lends itself predominantly to young, able bodied persons and does provide an opportunity for employment. I think where the continent needs to capitalize on this opportunity, it's one, making sure that we are able to first and foremost in the kind of the construction of the facilities attract the right expertise and talent to the continent in order to build and operate some of these facilities, while in parallel working quite closely to make sure that those skills and capabilities are transferred to your local as well as young workforce. And I think here, as the conversation globally moves around, the value of skills versus not, I think more important than the local workforce having your hard skills, which are important as well, I think the conversation is switching more to having a local young workforce which is trainable, right? So the ability to attain skills becomes more important than the skills themselves. And this will be quite important, right? As the skills demand in a rapidly evolving world, when you think about advances in data analytics, AI, machine learning, and the rest of it, I think an adaptable workforce will be more important than having a workforce that has, I would say, a set of fixed hard skills. So in short, right, I think the continent's young, capable workforce is a gift. It is a source of great potential, but if not managed correctly, I think it could be wasted potential in future.
Thank you for sharing that. We've talked about the benefits, but with mining comes many challenges and also risks, both locally and globally. We know that there are many global players competing for access to these minerals. So from your perspective, how should African nations balance global partnerships without losing sovereignty?
Yeah, I think this is actually like a core question, Tessa, right? Because ultimately, when you look at just how strategic the mineral endowment of the continent is, you know, the continent will participate in this next transition one way or the other. And I think a key question that African leaders and policymakers need to ask themselves is, are we participating on our own terms or following the plans of others? And I think one of the key risks that we run, especially if we don't have kind of a collaborative view of where we want to go to, from a strategic point of view, is that by not having a plan in place, by not having a very clear view of what we as the continent want to get out of this next transition, we run the risk of, again, being subject to the plans of others. And this has, and I won't get into kind of the historical elements of this, but I think the continent is well versed in, how badly this can go. So I think it will be quite important that, we get ahead of it. We develop our own strategies and views for how we want to develop our value chains, and we participate in these global alliances and partnerships on an equal footing as partners, and not only as suppliers of raw materials.
What safeguards would you say are needed to avoid this in terms of repeating history, almost at resource chaos?
Yeah, so I think the safeguards that need to be put in place is, I think, first and foremost, there needs to be a clear vision and strategy for how we want to develop these value chains. The second is that there needs to be work that is put into strengthening legislation as well as the regulation around the mining sector, as well as simplifying in certain instances. Because I think the one thing we don't want is to have legislation that is so onerous that it makes it almost impossible to invest. So I think there's a delicate balancing act here that needs to be played around making sure that the laws and regulations that are put in place are fit for purpose, but are not a hindrance to investments. And then I think another thing that countries need to think quite deeply on, again linked to the whole point around having a clear strategy and a view of where we want to play and how we want to play in the space, is making sure that in these agreements that are entered into, particularly in kind of the alliances and global partners, how do we make sure that these are paired up quite closely with a very strong ESG considerations, both environmental protections, making sure that from a social point of view, actively looking to secure the social license to operate from local communities, and lastly, making sure that there's strong governance in place, which will also alleviate some of the concerns that we've seen around kind of corruption, bribery, and the rest of it. I think this will be a central pillar. But I'd probably say, from my perspective at least, it's making sure that the continent and African countries more specifically have a clear view of what they need to get out of this next I would say boon in the minerals economy.
You briefly touched on the importance of the laws and regulations that are put in place. So, what one action should African policymakers take today to ensure the continent captures this once in a generation opportunity?
Yep. So I think the first thing that policymakers need to look at is, one, how do we make sure that the regulation and legislation is fit for purpose, simplified as much as possible to eliminate, I would say, kind of opportunities for, I would say, corruption and other nefarious practices which emerge when there's excessive bureaucracy. So that would be the first one. The second is, how do countries, I would say, go about safeguarding? How do countries go about safeguarding their own interests? What do I mean by that? When you think of kind of the economic drivers of individual projects, right? Your infrastructure, your financing, market access, and the rest of it. I think on the market access front, countries need to make sure that, one, any trade agreements that are entered into are balanced and mutually beneficial, and that can be done on inception. Secondly, is to make sure that, as part of the bill to develop our infrastructure as well as kind of bring down the cost of capital, how do we ensure that we get favorable terms, i.e., mineral access for infrastructure development, for lower costs of capital and the rest of it? And ultimately, what it boils down to, it's making sure that countries, one, have their own strategic interests in mind and make sure that these are fundamentally built into any agreements that they get into in going into the future.
So, talking about the future, looking ahead, if you imagine Africa in, say, 2040, what would success look like in terms of critical minerals?
Yeah, so what success would look like by 2040 is the continent capturing its fair share of the value. What do I mean by that? It means that the continent, at the very least, has gotten to a point where we are processing as much as we produce locally, which means we're capturing more of the downstream value chain proportional to our upstream contribution. Secondly, it's ensuring that, or a world in which the continent has transitioned from being a primarily minerals-based exporting entity into a player in tech applications. So moving further down the value chain, actually producing end products on the continent, going as far down as batteries, EVs, and the rest of it. And then lastly, looking at the workforce and when we think around kind of the challenges of poverty and unemployment, which are quite prevalent, I would see 2040 being kind of an opportunity for the continent to use kind of this mineral endowment to make sure that we alleviate or address in parts, if not in whole, the challenges that we have in terms of unemployment, which then cascade down into issues in poverty and the rest of it.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are good or when times are challenging. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yeah, keeping in line with the theme of collaboration and partnership, I think at this point in time in history, it's making sure that the continent and the countries within it understand that if we want to go fast, then we'll continue to move quickly individually in our siloed manner. But if we want to go far, then we will need to move together. And again, in the spirit of collaboration and partnership, I think this is an apt kind of call to action for countries to start collaborating more in order to mutually benefit from the opportunity that critical minerals presents.
Thank you, Lindo. I think from our conversation, it's clear that Africa's minerals aren't just about extraction, they're about transformation as well. But I think the real question is whether the continent can turn the geological advantage into lasting economic power. And the next decade or 2 or 3 will be very decisive. So fantastic. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. And thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge with us today.
Thank you for having me, Tess. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.